if one of the most infamous names in criminal history was never invented by the killer at all? What if the man the world remembers as Jack the Ripper never actually called himself that? Because hidden inside one of history's most famous murder cases is a detail that changes everything. The name that became legend may have come from a hoax letter, not from the murderer himself. And if that is true, then the most famous serial killer identity in history may have been built not by the killer, but by the chaos, panic, and media frenzy surrounding the case. When people hear the name Jack the Ripper, they imagine certainty. A shadowy murderer moving through the streets of Victorian London. A killer who taunted police. A monster who gave himself a name and made sure the world would never forget it. But the deeper you go into the case, the less certain that famous identity becomes. That idea changes everything. There are very few criminal names as recognizable as Jack the Ripper. Even people who know almost nothing about Victorian London know that name. It sounds theatrical. It sounds sharp. It sounds almost perfect. Like something designed to spread. And that is exactly what makes it suspicious. Because in many famous cases, nicknames are created later by journalists, investigators, or historians. But here, the name appeared while fear was still rising, while the murders were still fresh, and while newspapers were fighting for every shocking new detail. That matters, because once a name like that enters public imagination, it does not just describe a killer. It creates a persona. It gives him a voice, a character, a myth. And once that myth begins, it can become bigger than the truth. In 1888, London was already terrified. The Whitechapel murders had created fear across the city. People were afraid of the darkness, afraid of the unknown, afraid that a brutal killer was moving through the East End without being caught. Then, into that fear, came a letter addressed to the Central News Agency. A letter dated September 25th, 1888. A letter beginning with the words, "Dear Boss," and at the bottom of that letter was a name the world had never heard before, Jack the Ripper. That was the moment the legend found its title. The letter was chilling. It mocked the police. It sounded playful, cruel, and confident. To the public, it felt like direct communication from the murderer himself, like evil had finally spoken. And that is why it became famous. But here is the twist almost no one talks about. That letter may not have been genuine at all. In fact, it has long been treated as a hoax. And that changes the meaning of everything that came after it. Because if the letter was fake, then the name may have been fake too. Not fake in the sense that the murders were not real. The murders were horrifyingly real. But fake in the sense that the killer may never have chosen that identity for himself. The world may have been given that identity by someone else. And once the name appeared, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers picked it up. Readers repeated it. The public absorbed it. And within a short time, Jack the Ripper became far more than a label. It became a legend. That is important because names do more than identify. Names shape memory. A name can turn a criminal into a symbol. A name can turn violence into mythology. A name can make one case survive for generations while others fade into history. And Jack the Ripper is one of the strongest examples of that. It is dramatic. It is unforgettable. It sounds like a villain from fiction, almost perfect for a newspaper headline. Which brings us to something even stranger. The case did not receive only one mysterious letter. It received hundreds. Hundreds of letters were sent claiming to be from the killer. Some were threatening. Some were mocking. Some were obviously fake. And that flood of correspondence tells us something deeply unsettling. Once the public was given a character called Jack the Ripper, people started performing that character. They copied the voice. They copied the style. They copied the threats. And from that point on, the legend could keep growing even without the real killer doing anything at all. That is one of the eeriest parts of this story. The identity became self-sustaining. A famous letter appears. The name catches fire. Copycats join in. The public grows more fascinated. And the myth begins feeding itself. At that point, it becomes harder and harder to separate the murders from the performance surrounding them. And that is where the media becomes so important. To understand this case, you have to understand the world in which it happened. Victorian London was a city of newspapers, a city of competition, a city where sensational crime stories sold copies and captured attention. Whitechapel itself was already associated with poverty, danger, vice, and desperation in the public imagination. So when these murders happened, the conditions were perfect for panic. Editors wanted headlines. Readers wanted details. Rumors spread quickly, and every new development became fuel. In a climate like that, the press does not simply report a story. It helps shape the story. And that is why some later officials and historians became deeply skeptical of the famous Ripper letters. Because the letters were not just suspicious. They were almost too effective. They gave the case drama. They gave it language. They gave it a villain with a marketable identity. And that led to one of the most intriguing theories in the entire case, that some of the most famous letters may have been written not by the killer, but by journalists or people connected to the press. To be careful, that theory is not proven beyond all doubt. But it has persisted for a reason, because it explains something important. It explains why the name is so perfect, why the tone is so theatrical, why the persona feels almost designed for mass attention. If that theory is true, then the killer committed the murders, but the media helped create the immortal character. That idea is disturbing in a different way, because it means the case we remember today is not just a story of an unknown murderer. It is also the story of how public fear can be packaged, how violence can be branded, how a name can become stronger than evidence. Think about that. Most killers, even terrible ones, disappear into archives. Their crimes remain, but their names do not become global legends. So why did this one survive? Why did this one become books, films, documentaries, tours, endless theories, and more than a century of obsession? Part of the answer may be the name itself. Jack the Ripper is not just memorable. It is myth-making. It compresses fear into 2 words. It transforms an unidentified murderer into a dark icon. And once that happens, the icon begins overshadowing reality. That is why this unknown fact matters so much. Because once you realize the name itself may be unreliable, the entire mythology starts to shake. You begin to wonder how much of what people think they know about Jack the Ripper is actually based on evidence, and how much is based on repetition. How much came from the crimes, and how much came from the story built around the crimes? And when you ask that question, something else becomes impossible to ignore: the victims. Because while the legend of Jack the Ripper grew larger and larger, the women at the center of the tragedy often became smaller in public memory. Marion Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. These were real human beings, real lives, real suffering. But over time, many retellings have focused more on the killer's image than on the women who were murdered. That is one of the darkest consequences of myth. It does not just exaggerate the villain. It can erase the victims. And this is where the unknown fact becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes a correction. Because if the famous name was partly constructed, then the spell of that legendary figure begins to break. And once that spell breaks, you can see the case more clearly. Not as a gothic fantasy, not as a polished mystery brand, but as a brutal series of murders surrounded by panic, exploitation, rumor, and performance. That is a far less comfortable way to look at the case, but it is probably closer to the truth. And maybe that is the real horror here. Not just the murders themselves, but how quickly society turned those murders into spectacle. A city panicked. Newspapers competed. A dramatic name appeared. Letters flooded in. The public became obsessed. and an unidentified killer was transformed into one of the most famous criminal legends in history. That pattern feels modern because it is modern. We still do this. A violent event happens. A name spreads. A persona forms. Rumors multiply, and before long, the story people remember is not the same as the facts that began it. That is one reason this case still feels alive. Not because we know the truth, but because we recognize the machine that created the legend. So who created Jack the Ripper? Not the murderer as a real person. The murderer clearly existed. But the figure that survives in public imagination, the persona, the taunting voice, the myth wrapped inside the name, that may have been created collectively. By hoaxers. By newspapers, not by rumor. By public fear. By repetition. That is what makes this case so haunting. Even the killer's identity in history may be unstable. Not only do we not know for certain who he was, we may not even know whether the name the world remembers was ever truly his. And that means one of the most famous names in criminal history may have been born from a lie. A hoax, a headline. A performance. A perfect invention in the middle of chaos. And because it was memorable, it survived. Because it was dramatic, it spread. Because it was powerful, people believed it. So the next time you hear the name Jack the Ripper, remember this. That name may not have come from the killer. It may have come from the fear that surrounded him, from the newspapers that amplified him, from the hoaxes that fed the panic, from a world that was already learning how to turn violence into legend. And maybe that is why this case still grips people more than a century later. Not just because the murderer was never found, but because even his identity may be part invention. That is the unknown fact nobody talks about. The most famous part of the story may be the least reliable part of all. And once you realize that, the legend of Jack the Ripper stops feeling like a simple mystery and starts feeling like something far more disturbing. A murder case where the killer vanished, but the myth took on a life of its own.